You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 21st of February 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, the American envoy to Ukraine meets President Zelensky in Kyiv, but it doesn't go to plan. We'll ask why their joint press conference was cancelled. Also coming up, with the economy in recession, the far right on the rise and the threat of the US upending the existing world order, Germany goes to the polls this weekend. We'll look ahead to a bumpy ride. We'll hear from Manila as campaigning in fraught and midterm elections begins, and we'll head to Rotterdam to meet the co-founder of the Design Biennale.
We have the opportunity to still be niche. I think that is what we want to make sure that people from London, wherever, they come here and also have Rotterdam as a destination where you can come for design.
All that plus the theatre news, and Andrew Muller will bring us what we learned this week. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a quick glance at what else is happening in today's news. Israel says one of the bodies handed over by Hamas yesterday is not one of the hostages taken in October 2023. The UK and Norway have announced a joint defence agreement to protect underwater infrastructure, and creative control for the James Bond franchise has been handed to Amazon after more than 6 decades of the Broccoli family being in control of the 007 films. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, from hero to dictator who caused the invasion of his own country, Donald Trump has taken a scythe to the reputation of Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. Much of the world has called out Donald Trump for statements which simply aren't true. But true or not, the words of the US president have placed Ukraine in a desperate situation. Yesterday, the US envoy to Ukraine held a meeting with President Zelensky in Kyiv to discuss the possible next steps. But a joint press conference that had been called was cancelled at the last minute at the US request. Well, I'm joined now by Jenny Mathers, Senior Lecturer in International Politics at Aberystwyth University, and by Natasha Lindstedt, Professor of Government at the University of Essex. A good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Morning.
Jenny, if we can begin with you, this press conference that was cancelled at the last moment, what can we read into this other than that if they had something good to say, they would have tried to come out with something positive?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you always want to end this kind of a high-level meeting with some kind of a positive spin on what happened. Even if you can't say very much, you can at least say nice things about each other and hopeful things about the future. But the fact that they didn't feel comfortable even doing this, I think, really tells us a lot about the state of the relationship between Washington and Kyiv at the moment.
And Natasha, just looking at this, I mean, these two men, Volodymyr Zelensky and indeed... excuse me, and Mr. Kellogg, they had this situation whereby that they were neither of the two men were at the Riyadh meeting earlier on this week. Is that a suggestion that Kellogg has been sidelined?
Been sidelined because Trump doesn't want Kellogg involved because he's probably too pro-Ukraine in his estimation. And instead, he's been relying on Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff, who is essentially the father of one of Trump's sort of like business partners. And so it's really surprising the way things have kind of moved so quickly in some ways. But if you think about the fact that Trump is already just parroting Russian talking points and basically saying that, it was Ukraine that started the war and that Zelensky is a dictator, then it's, I guess, not that surprising that Keith Kellogg has sort of been iced out and we don't hear anything that happened in that press conference. And instead, he's relying on people who he really feels like he can trust regardless of whether or not they have any experience.
Just pick up on this a bit, would you please, Jenny, on this idea that US words are coming from Moscow. I mean, Why is Trump actually going with the Russian view of the war?
Well, that's a really good question. My theory is that there are really two factors driving this. One is the fact that Trump really admires Putin as a strong leader and sees Putin as someone that Trump can emulate. And we can see Trump emulating him both at home, trying to seize more control over domestic politics and also abroad in his very ruthless kind of actions towards other countries. But the other point, of course, is that money is a very important driver here, and we know that the talks in Riyadh included discussions about possibly the U.S. dropping sanctions, Russia opening up to U.S. business again, opportunities for U.S. businesses to make money. This is something else which Trump is very, very interested in.
And one wonders, as a result of what Jenny has just said, Natasha, that thought that this is all working towards a deal, insofar as Trump inevitably always is determined to claim victory no matter what the outcome of any kind of event is. But the idea that yesterday the Ukrainian president was berated for not jumping in and agreeing to hand over minerals. I think it was Mike Waltz yesterday went on television and said, just sign the mineral deal. Is this just simply playing into a narrative that Trump needs to get a deal, but it doesn't necessarily matter that probably Ukraine will ultimately get the support it needs from the States?
I don't know if Ukraine will get the support it needs from the States, from the U.S. I mean, it's a huge reversal of U.S. foreign policy. Biden administration had sought to isolate Putin. Instead, Trump is on a 90-minute phone call with him, and then they're meeting in Riyadh, and then he's pushing Ukraine to capitulate and to, at the very least, accept losing 20% of its territory. And then he's being called, a corrupt leader by Elon Musk, and that he wouldn't win an election if they had it. And he's pushing him to hold elections. I mean, I think Trump tends to just cozy up to dictators. He tends to always believe their talking points. This isn't the first time this happened. It's happened before many times with Putin about interference in the election. It happened with actually Kim Jong-un of North Korea as well, with Prince Salman in Saudi Arabia after the Khashoggi murder. So whenever there is a choice to be made between a dictator and someone that is much more democratic and a staunch U.S. ally, Trump tends to side with that more autocratic leader. And he's going to claim victory that he has, ended this very expensive war. That's the other talking point going on in U.S. media, that this is an unbelievably expensive war, that the Ukrainians are not grateful. And he has completely ignored the fact that all of this money that we're giving them actually feeds into the U.S. economy, because we're using U.S.-made weapons and artillery and so forth that are being sent over. So I think he wants to, have some sort of win, but this is coming at the expense of, decades of the way U.S. foreign policy normally works.
So, Jenny, now from Ukraine's point of view, does it need to consider fighting on without the U.S. help?
I think it absolutely must make those plans, and I'm sure this is exactly what military planners are thinking about and talking about actively in Kyiv, and talking about with European supporters, because this is also something that Europe is going to have to face. The Trump administration is demonstrating that it is not interested in maintaining, security guarantees, even the very basic ones, to its NATO allies. So this is a very, very serious shift in U.S. foreign policy and in transatlantic relations. And
when it comes to this shift in U.S. foreign policy, Natasha, I mean, how much do we sort of hinge everything on Trump and his sort of favouring the strong man, given the fact that there's a report in the New York Times this morning saying the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, previously a supporter of Ukraine, is publicly signalling a rapprochement with Moscow, but in private is seeking to reassure Europe and indeed the Ukrainians that nothing is really changing. And there is also a sense in US society that, and indeed within the Republican Party itself, that what Trump is doing now is not right.
There has been some murmuring in the Republican Party about the way this is being handled and that this is quite embarrassing. And you're right, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is a hawk, but had traditionally been very anti-Russia, very pro-Ukraine. So I think this is what happened also in the first administration, that you have people saying some things publicly that are very different to what they're saying privately, that there's sort of a culture of false reporting that develops, that people will say what they think Trump wants to hear to him in private meetings. Some of them might even tweet things that he might find appealing. But this is not a situation where everybody who are part of the decision-making team are on the same page as Trump. You have Elon Musk and you have Trump, but you have a lot of other people that, would just not be in agreement about completely abandoning Ukraine and then suddenly being cozy with Russia.
Finally, Jenny, from that division within the United States, let's focus on Europe now, because all eyes are focusing on Europe to see whether it can pull together. We've seen that Zelensky had a call with Emmanuel Macron yesterday, but Donald Tusk yesterday very publicly went online and said, enough talking, it is time to act. Let's finance our aid for Ukraine from Russian frozen assets. Let's strengthen air policing, the Baltic sentry and the EU borders with Russia. Let's swiftly adopt new fiscal rules to finance EU security and defence now. Is there now a sense that Europe is actually getting its act together here?
I think it's certainly a stronger sense than we've had at any time in recent memory. And I think a lot will probably depend on what happens next week in Washington with those talks between Keir Starmer and Donald Trump, and also between Macron and Donald Trump. If those do not result in Trump indicating a more positive attitude towards NATO, then I think it's going to be a huge boost to the movement within Europe to become much more sort of self-supporting, self-sustaining, making their own decisions. And I think the US will lose a lot of influence across the rest of NATO.
Jenny Mathers and Natasha Lindstedt, thank you both so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. This is The Globalist. 8:12 in Berlin, which is where we head now, because in the middle of all this, Germany goes to the polls on Sunday. And as if the country didn't have enough to worry about, Germany's stuck in recession. It is dealing with a rapid rise in support for the far right, and its government, until last month, was paralysed. Well, I'm joined on the line from Berlin by Quentin Peel, journalist and commentator, a former FT correspondent in both Bonn and Berlin. Good morning, Quentin.
Good morning.
How is Berlin looking at the moment? Are people sitting in the restaurants and the cafes and the bars and the Stubers all discussing what is likely to happen on Sunday?
There is a very curious sort of attitude of normality. There are lots of posters around saying, vote for the Social Democrats, vote for the Greens, vote for the AfD, and so on. And yet people don't seem to be really talking about it all the time. It's like as if there's a great elephant in the room, which is called Donald Trump, or it's called Ukraine, sitting out there, and everybody's just completely confused about whether it's going to change things. So everybody says, in theory, this is the most consequential election that Germany has had for decades. And yet, somehow, the result is almost a foregone conclusion. We're going to have a new chancellor called Friedrich Merz, who's a Christian Democrat, and it'll take months to negotiate a coalition. And that's where we are.
And does Germany have time to take its time fixing a coalition?
Well, it's going to take the time because that's the way Germany works. It was a very curious thing the other day when the security conference happened in Munich, and we had that extraordinary speech by J.D. Vance, the US Vice President, essentially saying to Germany, you should all be voting for the far right. It's as if nothing really changed in the election here. The opinion polls are pretty constant. The Christian Democrats are in the lead with a little bit over 30%. But what really scares people is that indeed the far right alternative for Germany is almost certain to come second, and it'll make the negotiations for a coalition really quite difficult.
And when you're sitting in Berlin, perhaps the alternative for Deutschland is not the greatest threat. But in other parts of the country, there will be great energy there, won't there, for the far right?
Yes, certainly, particularly in former East Germany. That's where the Alternative for Germany has been polling the best, up to 40% in some places. But everybody's been watching to see whether they're going to start picking up anti-immigration votes in the west of Germany. So everybody's watching areas like the North Rhine-Westphalia, the old industrial Ruhrgebiet, or even down in the south, the prosperous south of the country, where the economic downturn has really been making people feel the pinch. Are they going to start voting for the far right rather than the traditional centre-right and centre-left parties? At the end of the day, though, Germany's going to end up almost certainly with a grand coalition of centre-right and centre-left. So, yes, it matters, and yet nothing's changing.
And is there an awareness at all, I think you probably answered this question already, that the fact that this election is effectively determining the fate of Europe's largest economy for the next few years, and as a result, it sets the course for Europe as a whole. Is there a sense that that still is likely to happen?
Well, to be honest, from what I've seen so far, I'm not sure that it is. I've just been listening to Daniel Cohn-Bendit, the former European Green leader, on the radio. And he's saying, look, what's really shocking is this is an enormously important moment for Europe. Germany's right at the centre of it, and yet we're not really discussing the big issues. We're discussing tinkering around with the economy, having a little bit less bureaucracy, tightening up on immigration rules, but people aren't talking the big picture. And you do get that feeling. Germany is it's feeling a bit miserable, but it's not feeling revolutionary.
What went wrong?
Well, I think that people... I think the most important thing about this election is, are people going to actually stay at home? Because they're not terribly excited about what's going on. If they stay at home, that will probably help the more extreme parties. So people like the Alternative for Germany or the Sarah Wagenknecht left-wing but nationalist alliance. And they may get better votes. On the other hand, the way the German system works is that if small parties don't get into parliament, then it'll be easier for the big parties to form a coalition. So my prediction is that we're going to have a coalition headed by Friedrich Merz of the Christian Democrats and in government with the Social Democrats. And the AfD will still be an angry opposition.
What does this mean, this sort of slight fading away by Germany for its business and for its trade and for its reputation? Because if you look at the likes of Deutsche Welle, they talk about Germany's lack of qualified staff, skilled workers wanted. There's a skilled labour shortage. The Germany's business environment are demonstrating and demanding more support from their politicians. The things that we all used to would rely on as being absolutely a sort of stitched into German society, business and economy seem to be just diminishing an awful lot. So if you are looking at Germany now from the outside, I mean, what do we see or what do we feel?
I think we see a country that has been a fantastic success story starting to get rather creaky, as if it's getting thoroughly middle-aged and worried about the future. But it's also worried about the future because Germany is a country that's always been consensual, wanting to do deals, wanting to agree on a future that everybody's happy with. And I think Germany's finding it really difficult to deal with the geopolitical crisis that we face, with this ghastly war in Ukraine, in which Donald Trump seems to be absolutely determined to throw his lot in with Vladimir Putin in Moscow. Germany doesn't know how to deal with that. I mean, the debate is we mustn't send German troops to Ukraine because, after all, we did terrible things there during the war. So Sarah Wagenknecht has come out now and said it should be the Chinese and the Brazilians who send in the peacemakers to to Ukraine. Germany doesn't really want to have too much to do with this global crisis. And I think that, if you like, reality hasn't really started to set in. I think that's what Daniel Cohn-Bendit was saying this morning.
Quentin Peel in Berlin, thank you so much for joining us on the line. And just to let you know that Monocle's Chris Chermak is heading out to Germany later on this afternoon to bring us coverage, beginning on Monocle on Sunday, of all the events that are happening in the German elections. Still to come on today's programme.
We learned that the current cost-cutting crusade conducted by annoying billionaire Elon Musk's weirdo interns at the Department of Government Efficiency might have been more prudently entrusted to a chimpanzee with a dartboard.
Andrew Muller will bring us a lighter tone to what we learned this week. Stay with us on The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
AM. Let's continue with today's newspapers. Joining me is Zoe Grunewald, who's the Westminster editor at The Lead. Good morning, Zoe. How are you?
Good morning. Very well, thank you. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Good to have you with us on the programme. Right, let's have a look at the newspapers. Huge amounts of coverage and the fact that, and deep shock about the fact that one of the bodies returned by Hamas yesterday to Israel was not that of a hostage.
That's right. So it was expected that the body of a hostage called Shiri Bibas and her two sons would be returned. However, after forensic testing, it revealed that the body that had been returned by Hamas on Thursday was not Shiri, nor any other hostage. It was an unidentified body. Her two sons, Ariel and Kafir, were positively identified. But obviously this brings questions about where Shiri's body is, and also has been called a cruel and evil violation of the agreement at the terms of the ceasefire that have been undertaken by Hamas and Israel. And obviously, you know, this ceasefire is incredibly kind of precarious. We know that also there has been this explosion in Tel Aviv yesterday and a suspected terror attack. So clearly this just brings to light how incredibly fragile this whole thing is, and how there is still, of course, always the possibility of the ceasefire breaking and conflict breaking out once again between the two states.
And how have the press responded to this? Because obviously this is a breaking story which could precipitate the Israel-Hamas situation into catastrophe.
That's absolutely right. You know, there's a real kind of outpouring of questions about where Shiri's body is, but also how it could be that Hamas were not able to return the correct body. You know, the Hostages and Missing Families Forum said it was horrified and devastated by the news that Shiri was not returned, despite the agreement that was created. So this is likely to be a story that absolutely does not go away until Shiri's body is returned. And if it isn't able to be returned, there needs to be a really kind of comprehensive explanation as to why. Otherwise, you know, this could really undermine, as you say, the ceasefire agreement between the two states.
Let's move on to another story about Elon Musk. Musk says his mind is a storm as he waves chain store on stage in bizarre CPAC appearance. This is a story from The Independent, again widely shared across the world.
Absolutely. So, Elon Musk was on stage at the Conservative Political Action Conference, which we've been getting a lot of headlines from over this past week. He was being interviewed by Rob Schmidt, who is a Newsmax host. This is the second day of the conference. And he immediately brought on Argentinian President Javier Milei, who handed Elon Musk this power tool, this chainsaw that Milei himself is famous for wheeling around, in that he says he's going to cut government inefficiencies. And obviously we know that this is something Elon Musk has been talking about as well within Donald Trump's administration. So clearly the two see themselves as kind of brothers in this attempt to cut government inefficiencies. So yes, he was on stage. It was this kind of bejeweled chainsaw that he was wheeling around. And he said as well, he was asked what it was like inside the mind of a genius. And Musk replied, "My mind is a storm, so it's a storm." It's really kind of rather strange conference where all these various figures of the right have been able to parade around and talk about their plans. And yes, lots of headlines that have been coming out of this over the past week.
Moving on to a domestic story covered in the British domestic story, but with European consequences. The Times in London is talking about Britain offering an EU youth mobility scheme in Brexit reset talks. This is this very difficult, gentle path that the United Kingdom is trying to master in terms of how you open a door to Europe without opening a door.
Absolutely. This is really significant because there's been lots of discussion about how the UK is going to move forward with the EU, especially, in light of what's going on in Ukraine, in light of all the economic difficulties and the changes to the domestic political situation in the US. And one of the key sticking points between the EU and Britain was this kind of aspect of free movement, which is the youth mobility scheme, which used to mean that Britons and young members of the European Union between the ages of 18 to 30 could move about freely. They could study, they could work, and they could travel. But obviously, since Brexit, that hasn't been possible. But now there is the suggestion that actually Keir Starmer is going to create this agreement. It will be slightly different. There will be the number of visas issues under the scheme could be capped. They might have to pay a kind of NHS stipend, and they won't be entitled to UK benefits. But this is, I think, a real kind of sea change in the British government's approach to the EU, where you can see Keir Starmer actively creating a situation where he wants to move closer to them and can see the value of European students. Particularly, we know that the university system here in Britain is in a real crisis, but also young immigrants coming to work in the UK, which can fill some of the economic holes we are experiencing.
Finally, journalism bids goodbye to one of its greatest food writers this weekend, Jay Rayner. Famous, I don't know if you ever read the article, the review of Le Cinq, the Hotel Georges V a few years ago, when he said it's decorated in various shades of taupe, biscuit and FU. He's got his parting shot, and he basically tells us everything that he wanted to ever tell us about dining and going out and all the rules and regulations, and he doesn't hold back, and it's brilliant.
Yeah, it's a fantastic piece. It's basically just his last column for The Guardian, where he is writing about all the things he's learned having been a restaurant reviewer for 15 years. So some of my favourite include him. This is a real bugbear of mine. He talks about restaurants that serve small sharing plates, but the table isn't big enough for all the dishes that arrive. I don't know if you've ever had that. It's incredibly annoying. One thing that would really wind up my dad, he said food should always be served on plates, not on slates, not on garden trowels and not on planks. Absolutely agree with that. It's incredibly annoying. Also, most dishes can be improved with the addition of bacon. I think that is a very wise bit of advice that we can all carry around with us. But yes, if you are reading The Guardian, it's a fantastic piece about all the things he's learnt in the restaurant industry.
There's a fear that with the departure of Jay Rayner, please everybody read his review of Le Cinq. It's just the best thing ever. I think it had 2 million people reading it, and it became world famous because it was just so brilliantly devastating. Is that Jay Rayner doesn't pull his punches, and he doesn't mind being a little bit just being a bit more old school, to be honest. And he talks about fat is where the flavour is. Buffet where good taste goes to die. The kitchen knives in holiday rentals are always terrible. Take your own. Hyper expensive foods are about status. Bechamel sauce is easy to make. Just follow the damn recipe. There's a wonderful thing that he describes about orange wine as well. He says the kind of wines that natural wines fan adore smells of uncleaned pig's bottom and are horrible. I mean, what I really liked about Jay Rayner is that he didn't mind offending, but in the most gloriously good-mannered and well-meaning way.
Absolutely. There's a real sense that he, as you say, he's very kind of honest in who he is and is happy to lean into that kind of almost that archetype of the old school restaurant critic who is a little bit grumpy, but also very, very kind of opinionated. But you're right, he does that with a real sense of humour and a real kind of wryness that I think is quite distinct to his writing in The Guardian. And you're absolutely right. If anyone has some spare time today or over the weekend, do have a read of some of Jay Rayner's best restaurant columns, because they will make you laugh and they will paint such a brilliant picture of what it was like in that restaurant that you probably wouldn't even need to go. He his writing is brilliantly colourful.
We lose a great this weekend. Zoe Greenveld, thank you so much for joining me on Monocle Radio. The time here in London is 7:29 a.m. A look now at what else we're keeping an eye on today. Israel says one of the bodies handed over by Hamas yesterday is not one of the hostages taken in October 2023. The Israeli military says it hasn't received the body of Shiri Bibas, but had been given those of her 2 young sons. Israel has accused Hamas of a serious violation of the ceasefire agreement. The UK and Norway have announced a joint defence agreement to protect underwater infrastructure during a visit inside the Arctic Circle, including to the Norwegian border with Russia. The British Defence Secretary set out plans for a new agreement, including joint training missions. The veteran Republican leader Mitch McConnell, who sharply criticised Donald Trump after the Capitol Hill riots, has announced he's to leave the US Senate. The 83-year-old is one of the longest-serving lawmakers in the Senate and indeed in US history. And creative control for the James Bond franchise has been handed to Amazon. After more than 6 decades, the Broccoli family is to step back from the 007 films. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now let's look at another story which we've been paying attention to. It's about design, but not about art, because Birkenstock has become the subject of a court case. A court in Germany has found that the legendary sandals are indeed pieces of design, and they are not pieces of art. Here's Monocle's Jack Simpson with the story.
Art has a way of transcending class and wealth. It was under this ethos, perhaps, that Birkenstock has sought copyrighted work of applied art status for its classic sandals, which are worn by both the yacht-faring yuppies and field-dwelling hippies. However, the Federal Court of Justice in Karlsruhe, Germany, the body tasked with ruling for the application, has sided with the brand's imitators. The line between art and design is blurry. But if you were to try to make a distinction, it's that design has an element of function while also eliciting emotional response. Birkenstock ticks both these boxes, but does that make it any less worthy of copyright? No. If anything, it makes it, and design more broadly, worthy of such protections. Whether the buyer of Steve Jobs' well-worn Birks for $220,000 at auction in 2022 bought them to wear or was moved by them remains a mystery.
Thank you, Jack. That was Monocle's Jack Simpson there. For more from Monocle's editors and correspondents, sign up to our newly redesigned daily newsletter, The Monocle Minute, at monocle.com/minute. Campaigning for the midterm elections in the Philippines has begun just a few days after the Vice President Sara Duterte was impeached. As is so often the case with midterm elections, the votes are being seen as a referendum on the incumbent President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Ronald Holmes is Professor of Political Science at De La Salle University in Manila. A very good afternoon, very good morning to you, Ronald.
Good afternoon, good morning, good day.
So we have a very fractured political backdrop to these midterm elections, don't we?
Yeah, we do. We have quite an intense intra-elite rivalry at the national level between the incumbent president, the vice president, and her family.
So what's happened?
Well, they ran together. It was an alliance of convenience. Eventually, the alliance proved to be successful for their own motive, which was to get into the presidency and the vice presidency. But given that it was largely for convenience to generate support from their bailiwicks, it was expected it would not in any way last that long. But of course, surprisingly, it did not last for more than 2 years. No, it started early in late in 2023, and it has escalated since then.
So we now have the Dutertes and the Marcoses at odds with each other, even though he is president, she is vice president, albeit one who is being impeached. What effect is that having on the midterm elections?
Well, each alliance, each camp is trying to project that the impeachment, for example, on the part of the Marcos camp is to make sure that they can hold Sara Duterte accountable for her alleged misuse in terms of government resources. They even point out that the misuse of such resources, largely confidential funds, even started when she was mayor of Davao. On the other hand, the Duterte camp is saying that even the Marcoses are also engaged in such grand corruption because of the current budget, the way that the budget is patronage ridden. So both camps are trading accusations of wasting the people's resources or the public resources. And it's really more a rhetorical competition between two groups that have been basically silent in the past. With regard to the effect on the elections, the elections that we're having basically involve from the local level up to the national level. There are more than 18,000 positions. And the people competing for these positions do not necessarily need to take sides between the administration and the Duterte. So, except in some areas where, let's say, the Dutertes or the Marcoses will have more influence.
Explain to us, therefore, who is going to more likely to sort of seize victory here, given the fact that, as I mentioned at the beginning of this interview, a midterm election is generally a referendum on those in power.
Yeah, some say, well, basically, midterm elections generally are a referendum on the performance of the incumbent administration. In reality, in the Philippines, however, it is a competition among those with resources. The ones in contention, the administration definitely has more resources than the ones that are opposed to them. But regardless of that, we have well-entrenched political clans that are competing with one another, and a number of them basically have no competition. So we don't expect changes in terms of who will retain power. At the national level, in the senatorial elections, the administration basically selected the more popular candidates. So we expect them to get about maybe 9 or 10 out of the 12 slots. In the same manner, in the Duterte camp, you would have about 2 to 3 candidates that are in contention, at least in the surveys. So it's the conflict between Bongbong Marcos and Sara Duterte may be something that is generating some interest on the part of the politicians, but essentially the politicians are going to be the same ones, not the ones that are incumbent right now, who have a higher chance of being elected, given that they're well entrenched, the dynasties that we have in the Philippines.
And these dynasties and the fact that they are so well entrenched, as you say, what does it do for the economy or for business or for trade when you know that when we go into the elections in the next couple of years, in 2028 in the presidential election, that it will be the same faces and they will be at odds with each other?
Well, basically, yes, it will be the same faces. And then, yeah, that's a problem with the Philippines. We have a short electoral cycle, and the tendency of people is really to swing or gravitate from one political camp to another. We have basically no political parties, no bona fide political parties to begin with. We always say that they're just like clothes. The politicians change their parties every time that there's an election and after an election. And the main organizing element in Philippine politics and elections will be these dynasties. They control about 80% of the gubernatorial seats in the country. There are 82 provinces, and they're increasingly taking control of Congress, both in terms of the single-member districts and the party representatives. So its effect on the economy, definitely it's bad because, from the perspective of it's too exclusive. It's not an open access society to begin with. It's a limited access. There's a concentration of power in the hands of a few political elites. And they tend to work also in favor of some of the oligarchs. So as the economy is structured in such, with so much concentration of wealth, you also have politics where the power is concentrated in the hands of the few.
Finally, the internal wrangling will have international impacts. And when it becomes an issue of how the Philippines deal with aggressions in the South China Sea by Beijing, what effect does instability at home have there?
Well, at least for the meantime, given that Bongbong Marcos would remain as president until 2028, it may not have an impact in terms of the Philippine position on the South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea. We don't know after Bongbong Marcos, if the Dutertes come back, will they pivot back to China? And this will definitely have a consequence in terms of the Philippine claim on areas that are disputed in the South China Sea. Because as you know, right now, Bongbong Marcos is more towards the West-led Security Alliance, the Indo-Pacific Alliance. So it's going to go on for the next 3 years, but after 2028, who knows? The president is the chief foreign policy maker, and as we know, even in other countries with presidential systems, it can just swiftly change after an election.
Ronald Holmes, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. Now, yesterday marked the opening of the Design Biennale Rotterdam. The inaugural edition features exhibitions, open studios and workshops across the harbourside city. With the theme, What's Real is Unfamiliar, the curation focuses on experimental and unique collectible design. Well, at Bahnhof, a former electricity station for the city's trams, and for the next 10 days, the hive of activity, Monocle's Maylie Evans caught up with Sarah Schulten, the co-founder of Design Biennale Rotterdam, and Maylie began by asking her to explain how the event came about.
There were so many designers that have their studios here. A lot of designers that I knew, and I was watching their work in Milan, and I had no idea that they were based in Rotterdam. We go a lot to International Biennial, and we always love that with this you go to a city and you explore the city in a different way that you would go to places that you would normally not see. And we thought Rotterdam is the perfect city for this because, well, we are now at Bahnhof, one of the venues where we have an exhibition. Normally you would never get here because it's unexpected. And Rotterdam is a difficult city. In Amsterdam, you know where to go. It's beautiful everywhere. And in Rotterdam, you really need to find it. So with this biennial, we want to make it easier for people to find these incredible spaces. We wanted to start small, but we had more and more designers that wanted to be a part of it.
I was going to say, you said start small. We've got over 100 designers, over 15 venues. Yeah. I don't know about small.
No, it's absolutely not small anymore. And it's because of the enthusiasm from the people here around us. And everybody wanted to do something. And it's super good what they did. With every decision we make, we think, is it still design or are we leaning more towards architecture and art? And I think what we also hear from a lot of panelists today and who were speaking is it's not necessary to create these boundaries because why would you?
The theme this year is What's Real is Unfamiliar. There's an emphasis on experimental, speculative design. Why did you want this to be the focal point for this first edition? What kind of message are you trying to send about Rotterdam and its design scene?
We go to fairs and biennials all the time, and there's a lot of very important and urgent themes. But I am always doubting a little bit if it's real. It always feels a little bit sort of nonsense. I also appreciate a lot what people are doing, so I don't want to be negative about it, but it feels sometimes, okay, you talk about sustainability, but hundreds of people flying here for this biennial, so is it really what you are trying to say? And we also don't pretend to have the truth here, but when we were starting to think about the theme, we said it has to be no bullshit. It has to represent what the city is about, no bullshit.
And you kind of mentioned there that Rotterdam is a place, no nonsense, no messing about. But, you know, the city is a place of reinvention and resilience. It's effectively been rebuilt since after the Second World War. But I wondered if there's any other characteristics about this place that have sort of infused the event we've got on here. What is it about Rotterdam that makes it such a brilliant place to hold an event like this?
Well, I think at first it's the quality of the designers that are here, and there are probably many reasons for why they're here. One of them must be the Design Academy in Eindhoven, that's really good, and then they come to Rotterdam for their studio. And there's not 5 that I can name. It's seriously like 50 super great designers that have their studios here. So that helps to make something that's very good. What is also about Rotterdam is collaboration, and that's what we were talking today about with the designers as well. There's no competition, everybody's helping each other. It's probably also because there is no reason to compete here in Rotterdam because you show your work in other cities.
Across the design calendar, you've got big events like Salone, you've got 3 days of design, and each have their own character. Some have been running for decades. What is the tone that you hope to set? What would you like it to grow to be?
Part of it is that it's local, But it has to have an international connection as well, because that's interesting also for local people. But we want it to be at the same time big in terms of the quality and niche. We have the opportunity to still be niche. I think that is what we want to make sure that people from London, wherever, they come here and also have Rotterdam as a destination where you can come for design.
Sarah Schulten there, the co-founder of Design Biennale Rotterdam, in conversation with Monocle's Maylee Evans. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Now it's time for an alternative look at the last 7 days. Here's what we learned.
We learned this week not to mess with the buns in Japan.
I can't wait to see where this goes.
Okay. Tell me more.
Let's
see where this goes.
We learned that a shopper in Fukuoka had been run in by Plod after lightly poking a sesame and cream cheese muffin through its packet in order to determine the firmness of the breadly comestible, and then left the shop without making a purchase. We learned that this was sufficient to get the bap-prodding ne'er-do-well arraigned for criminal damage. So, and let's get all these out of the way, she's toast. Oh, we'll need to pay some dough. It's a crummy situation. We're on a roll. Meanwhile, on the American continent, we learned that there are presidents who cheerfully scam their own supporters out of their savings. Listeners anticipating some sort of extremely clever bait-and-switch device may now award themselves a point. For we learn this not of the country on the American continent of which you may, all things considered, have been thinking, but another. We learned from Argentina that cryptocurrency may not be an absolutely rock-solid, reliable investment.
No, really? Oh, that blows my mind.
No way. Blow me down.
We are indebted, though not as much as some Argentinians, for this lesson to Argentinian president and readily imaginable bass player in a Stranglers tribute band, Javier Milei. We learned that President Milei had promoted from his lofty position a cryptocurrency called Libra, the price of which accordingly lurched abruptly up, shortly before, as is very often the way with the price of things which do not in any meaningful sense exist, plummeted back down. We did learn, however, that unlike certain countries on the American continent which may have come to mind earlier, Argentina does still have some sort of at least semi-functioning system of checks and balances, and that therefore President Milei faces possible impeachment and or criminal charges over this apparent instance of what we learned is known as rugging, an abbreviation of rug pulling, evocative of a red carpet being rolled out to investors before being whisked from beneath their feet. A weirdly satisfying sound effect, that one. Can I get some general muttered agreement? Anyway, we learned from the country on the American continent of which you probably were thinking earlier.
Oh no.
That everything is going just swimmingly. We learned that, on balance, the current cost-cutting crusade conducted by annoying billionaire Elon Musk's weirdo interns at the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, which isn't a government department and has a thus far iffy record where efficiency is concerned, might have been more prudently entrusted to a chimpanzee with a dartboard. We learned that among the federal employees arbitrarily canned by DOGE were staff of the Department of Energy attached to the National Nuclear Security Administration, for whom, we learned, the clue in the name was insufficient protection.
Under its cost-cutting plans, DOGE requested the layoffs without knowing that the Energy Department staffers were specialized in handling America's nuclear weapons.
We did learn, however, that not all of the mass sackings of federal employees were acts of spite or stupidity. Some were just sort of mishaps.
NBC News reports this weekend the Agriculture Department accidentally fired several employees working on the government's response to the bird flu outbreak.
Probably fine, not like any transmissible viruses jumping from animals to humans have caused us any problems lately. But we learned that if US President Donald Trump appeared serenely disinterested in the spectacle of the wires being ripped out of the federal government he is supposed to be leading, he had his reasons, i.e. being preoccupied with foreign policy, in which realm we learned from the great sage that the war launched by Russia against Ukraine for... let's check again... no good reason whatsoever, was in fact all Ukraine's fault.
You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal.
Which begs any number of punchlines about the headache the US could have spared itself in the 1940s had it simply ceded Hawaii to Japan after Pearl Harbor, though the chances that this is what Donald Trump genuinely thinks have to be assessed as non-zero. We'll be needing the General Muttered Agreement crew back in.
I think so.
But we learned that the making great again of America continued. We learned that, on the instructions of the new administration, the US Department of Defense, which might have been assumed to have one or two more pressing concerns, has embarked on an ideological purge of the libraries of the schools it operates for the children of service personnel and DoD employees overseas. And we learned that one subversive tract, which may shortly be heading for the bonfire, is...
who cared about having 1 million freckles when she had 1 million friends? And maybe that mom was right, and her freckles would go away a little. And freckle-faced strawberry really was like everybody else.
An excerpt there from Freckle-Face Strawberry, read by its author, the actor Julianne Moore. We learned that the DoD invigilators protecting military children from this sordid and depraved brainwashing have placed Freckle-Face Strawberry, and we quote, under review. Come on, lads, it's not that complicated. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller.
Thank you, Andrew. The time here in London, 7:52. Let's find out what's going on the stage. Matt Wolfe is the theatre critic at the International New York Times and joins me in with his copious notes and lists and programmes.
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, he always brings me a programme.
And it's right here.
Gorgeous.
Yeah,
it's lovely. You. And your note-taking is about as coherent as mine. So I've never seen self-imposed margins on a piece of plain paper. I digress. What's happening on the stage, Matt? Lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you. Lots of celebrities known the world over who happen for various reasons to be converging on the London stage, many of them doing Shakespeare, starting with Jonathan Bailey. Now, I remember 2 decades or more ago, Jonathan Bailey was at the National Theatre playing Cassio in Othello. Since then, he's been in Bridgerton, he's in the new Jurassic movie, and of course, he's Fiyero in the film of Wicked. You could forgive him for never wanting to set foot on stage again, but in fact, here he is back with the director of Othello at the Bridge Theatre in Nicholas Hunter's production, Richard II. This is a really ambitious choice of part for him because it's one of Shakespeare's most luxuriantly written plays. The language is very, very rich, and it's not something you take on lightly.
No, you sit down and you sort of strap yourself in for this one. There's not a lot of, there's not a lot of action in Richard II, so you have to have a particular strength to carry it.
Yes, and I mean, the play is full of sort of warring nobles and loyal courtiers all sort of dressed in monochrome colors. And I kept thinking to myself on press night, what are the kind of Wicked and Bridgerton fans thinking as they watch this, going, who the hell are all these people? But, of course, there is only one Jonathan Bailey to kind of see center stage. And what I love about the play, and of course very apposite for our time, or really for all time, is that it's about a man-child of a king who sacrifices the crown and in so doing discovers his humanity. And that is accompanied by this gorgeous, gorgeous language like, I wasted time and now doth time waste me. It doesn't get much better than that. I don't think, to be honest with you, that this play revels in the language quite as much as it could, and some of it is rather dry. They've taken a leaf from Succession, the television series, so it's got a kind of hipster boardroom feel. You see Richard II snorting coke at one point, which seemed to me kind of irrelevant. But I give Jonathan Bailey full marks for returning to his roots, and as long as he wants to do theatre, people will continue to see him do it.
Again, do we have this successful translation? We've seen this with Sigourney Weaver. You have someone who is brilliant on screen and yet cannot fill the space on the stage. Is this the same case with him, or does he triumph here?
Well, no, I mean, he certainly does well enough. The Sigourney Weaver comparison directly is with Tom Hiddleston and Hayley Atwell in Much Ado About Nothing, which also opened back-to-back, in fact, Richard II. Amazing week for internationally known stars going back to their stage origins. Tom Hiddleston and Hayley Atwell both began on stage, and they both, in fact, worked with Jamie Lloyd before, Jamie Lloyd being the director of Much Ado. Now, this Much Ado with the Theatre World Drury Lane follows on from Sigourney Weaver and The Tempest. That production was not a success, as I think people are aware by now. This Much Ado is going to be a barnstorming success. It's gaudy, it's irreverent, it's cheeky. There's a certain amount of flesh-bearing. It feels like a party. It feels frivolous, but in fact, the current of emotion that runs through the play is quite genuinely achieved. This is a play about two people who really do love each other, who have to realize that by the final curtain. They put all sorts of obstacles in their own way, and by the end, everything has been stripped clean, and they can actually express to one another the mutual affection. I was particularly impressed by Hayley Atwell as Beatrice, one of Shakespeare's most glorious female parts, who gets, these fabulous lines like "a star dancing under that was I born," and you really feel her heart in the piece, not just kind of an attempt to be silly and fun, which the production also is. How can you not love a production where the set is basically bare except lots of confetti and a giant heart with nipples on top of it?
What is there more to ask for from the theatre? And Much Ado is often used as that vehicle when they bring two famous when they bring two famous people together, and they test their mettle on stage. I think we saw David Tennant and Catherine Tate do it a few years ago, and it's a really good vehicle for that, because it's also a really good entry. If there is such a thing as entry level Shakespeare, this is it.
Well, yes, I mean. Also, in this production, if people go, oh, Shakespeare, 3 hours, I'm not going to know what the hell's happening, they've cut the comic subplot here of Dogberry and Verges, the constable, the sort of comic relief that too many Shakespeare plays get bogged down in. It's not here. The upshot is that certain supporting roles, like Margaret, played by the wonderful American non-binary performer Mason Alexander Park, gets kind of the ante is up for that character, and it allows 10 actors seated often on plastic chairs to just seize one of the largest spaces in London and run with it.
Matt, you've got 35 seconds to tell us about Unicorn. Tell us if this is worth going to.
A very peculiar but fascinating play by Mike Bartlett, who wrote Cock, a play that Jonathan Bailey was in a couple of years ago. You think it's going to be about sex. It's about an older couple who bring a younger woman into their orbit, and it turns out to be about death. So you go from sex to death across 2.5 hours. How do you like that? It's not remotely titillating. There are more bare chests in the Shakespeare plays, but it certainly is dystopian.
Marvellous. I think we said beforehand, it's like Freud all in one
It's
neat
Freud
package.
in one lovely lesson.
What's there not to love about that? Matt Wolf, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. I'm afraid the warmest of thanks to all my guests. And thanks too to our producers, Chris Chermak, Carlotta Rebello and Hassan Anderson. Our researcher was Maisie Ringer and our studio manager Flynn Simons, with editing assistance from Mariella Bevan. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The Briefing is live at midday here in London, and The Globalist is back at the same time on Monday. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you for listening. Have a great weekend.